I'm gonna, I'll start, sorry. Don't know about a lot of you, but I do love a list. When I'm thinking about what I need to do, I write a list. And then I divide my list into different categories, and then I might write a list of lists. And so often, I often say to Paul, where's that list? And he says, that scrap of paper. I threw it away. I'm like, no, it was my list. And without it, I'm lost. And when I've done something that's not on the list, I write it onto the list so that I have the satisfaction of ticking it off. One chocolate bar, and that's it. Every time Paul and I talk about something, I get out my notebook and I start a list. It helps me plan, it helps me think through what needs to be done, and it also gives me a great sense of satisfaction when I cross things off. However, I never get to the end of my list. Even the days I make lists of things to do today, the lists all have titles of course, there are still things that need doing at the end of the list that I've not been able to do. I run out of time, I run out of energy, I run out of motivation, and then it gets added to things to do tomorrow's list, or things to do next week list, or things to do at some point when I have time list. I imagine many of you have lists too. They may be actual lists like mine, or just a mental awareness of things that need doing. And I so often start sentences with, I need to, or I should. These shoulds, these need tos, these lists can be overwhelming. They might be relating to work, friends, family, house, people to contact, all good and meaningful. But do you ever get the feeling that it's the list that's in charge? Like you're not the one in control, and there's no end, there's no rest. We're currently doing a series on work, and the other week I preached about how work is worship. Paul spoke last week on about calling, and we talked often, God is at work, but God also rested, and God gifted us with a day to rest. However, restlessness seems to be a description of the human condition. In Ecclesiastes 2:20-23, it says, "So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work in this world. Some people work wisely with knowledge and skill. They must then must leave their fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. This too is meaningless, a great tragedy. So what do people get out of this life for all their hard work and anxiety? Their days of labour are filled with pain and grief. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. It's all meaningless. It's smoke and vapour. It's hard to get our heads round. Why bother? It's hevel." Augustine of Hippo wrote that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. But the truth is that many Christians do not experience a sense of rest in their lives. We're in an age of anxious striving. Let's read Hebrews 4:1-11. God's promise of entering his rest still stands, so we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news, that God has prepared this rest, has been announced to us just as it was announced to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listen to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. For the others, God said, "In my anger I took an oath, they will never enter my place of rest." Even though this rest has been ready since he made the world. We know it is ready because of the place in the scriptures where it mentions on the seventh day. It mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. But in the other passage, God said, "They will never enter my place of rest." So God's rest is there for people to enter. But those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted. "Today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts." Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them this rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest still to come. So there is a special rest, still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labours, just as God did after creating the world. So let us do our best to enter that rest. But if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, we will fail. Amen. The letter to the Hebrews is a sermon, and the theme throughout it is to keep going. Times are tough. They were then, they are now. But keep looking for Jesus and keep looking after each other. The writer of Hebrews is using the story of Israel's escape from Egypt to make his point, to step into what God has done, to acknowledge God's power, to trust it. Because if you don't, you can't be at rest. And there's a biblical theme that is crucial to this idea of rest. And the writer uses it here. This is the idea of Sabbath. I know that can sound like a legalistic idea, that Jesus challenged the legalism of Sabbath keepers. However, the Sabbath rest remains important to the followers of Jesus to this day. And Sabbath basically means stop. It's a stop day. So I'm going to use this passage from Hebrews to draw out a few things. And the first is that rest is written into creation. Before it went wrong, before the world was broken, there was a rest day. Genesis 2 says, "So the creation of heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation. So he rested from all his work and blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation." So why is it that the all-powerful Creator God rested? It's not because he was tired. God doesn't get tired. But it's because his work was done. The creative process was finished. The seventh day is holy because it points to the fullness of creation. What had been done was complete. It was enough. It was good. If you're anything like me, there's always more to be done. Before I even finish a task, I'm often thinking about the next task in hand. I'm already adding it to my list so I don't forget it. But the seventh day is a stop day. It's a day that is set apart. It's good. To stop is to say there is something more important than the next task. There is one above it all that is sufficient. When the Israelites were rescued from Egypt as a covenanted people, it was vital that they should be a people of rest. Because if they weren't a people of rest, they were still, in fact, in slavery. The second thing from this passage is that it's possible for rest to elude us, even people of God. The writer of Hebrews is drawing on the story of the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. It's a brilliant story. If you've never read it, read it. It's in the book of Numbers. The miraculous escape, the miraculous provision. They're about to enter the promised land. The spies that they send are afraid. They have seen and they know and they've experienced all that God has done and can do. But that seems to slip their mind and they say there's others that are more powerful. So what stops us from entering into the rest? We live in a culture where we need to maximise our productivity and efficiency. There's lots of books, apps, courses that help us in this. There's always a need for more. More things done, more money, more production, more joy, more. The only role that rest plays in this culture is to recharge your batteries so you can go again because you're a machine. Sometimes we work because we love it. It's connecting us to our calling. Sometimes work is a great distraction. Sometimes we work hard because society says we should be having an impact. We feel that we need to justify our existence in our doing. It's interesting, after World War II, Paul Mazur of the Lehman Brothers wrote, "We must shift America from a needs to a desire culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. I think we'll say he succeeded in that aim. And that's it, isn't it? We're not just as important as workers, but we're also consumers. Buyers of things that we don't need with money that we don't have. If you're not using your time to work, you're using it to consume. Constantly under pressure to play a part in the economy one way or another. And we're also in an age where we are left restless by the need to find our true meaning outside of community, discovering who we are as unique human beings. Tim Keller, when he talks about the Sabbath, often quotes an article in the New York Times by the author Judith Shulevitz. She was a secular Jew who spoke about her experience of returning to the practices of Sabbath. And she said, not only did the drudgery give way to festivity, family and friend gatherings, and occasionally worship, but the machinery of censorship shut down too, stilling the eternal inner murmur of self-reproach. My third and final point from this text is that we should let Jesus lead us into that rest. The writer is reflecting on Psalm 95, which is written by King David, in a time when the people of Israel were living in the promised land, when the Sabbath was scrupulously observed, when the people of Israel are free from their enemies, yet they had not experienced this Sabbath rest. There is another day. Let's call it today. Let's call it now, when the true rest of God will come. Written into creation. People in the promised land, observing the law but somehow not at rest. Jesus comes. So many of the stories about Jesus' conflict with his own people are stories around the Sabbath. Healing on the Sabbath. The disciples doing things they shouldn't on the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord of stop. Jesus is Lord of enough, Lord of holiness, Lord of fullness of creating. The one who brings the true Sabbath. Because the work is done. On the cross, he utters the words, "It is finished." There is lots of work to be done. But there is a work that is finished and can't be done now, only received. So what? So let's stop. Stop working. Put aside some time to stop. Accept and delight in God's gift of rest. Accept that God is enough. That the work you've done is enough and that you can rest in God's provision. Worship God who gives the Sabbath to us as a good gift. I know it's not easy. I know I putting it away a day or half a day, it takes planning, it takes preparation. You know, if you're not going to be washing the clothes that day, that means you have to wash them another, little things. But move things around, make that effort. You're lovingly invited to take it, to stop and to rest, because he is enough. I'm just going to finish with a passage from Matthew, and then Paul's going to play another song, I think. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." Amen.